introduce our speaker. So many of you, if you've been from on the library side, if you've attended a couple of things we've done this year with Patrick Callahan, I think you will agree that we have been very fortunate to have stumbled across him. In January, we had a fantastic session on communicating city library communication, and I'll take this opportunity for any of our city friends here, if you're interested in watching that communication on how you can be a good partner with your library director and library board, I'd be happy to send you the link. Then last week, 2 weeks ago, we did a session on the 10 habits of highly effective library boards, which Mr. Callahan revised for us from a session with some of our city friends might have seen at the Iowa League of Cities conference back in the fall in Coralville. And now, of course, today we're here talking about 28 agreements. Now, I know it's not too long after lunch as we're recording this, but I do hope that you've had your afternoon cup of tea or coffee and a candy bar maybe, because despite the title, which involves the word contracting in the very title of the webinar, this is not going to be a snooze fest. This should be some really exciting information. So Patrick, I'll leave it to you to fill in any background I might have missed, and I will share my screens here now, and you should be seeing my slides. Is that true?
Okay. All right. Well, for those of you who do not know me, if you're a city clerk or you're a city manager watching, a pretty good chance you may have heard my name, because I've done numerous presentations at the Iowa League of Cities, and most recently did one for the Iowa Municipal Finance Officers meeting out in Des Moines on October of last year. My topic then was orientation sessions for mayors and councils, but today we're going to talk about 28 agreements. And my involvement in history in 28 agreements goes back well over 30 years. Okay. And as you can see, I'm old. I've been around this a long time. And I started my career in city government 48 years ago, way down in Southeast Iowa in the town of Fort Madison, where I was in the public works department there, and went from there to West Point, Iowa, where I was city administrator. And from there went to Maquoketa, where I was city manager for 14 and a half years, and then shifted gears and got out of that role of city manager and worked as a consultant. But during that time with the Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Iowa, we got a grant from the Department of Economic Development. And part of that grant was to do more to encourage the use of 28 agreements and to do more towards service sharing throughout the whole state. And so we did a number of pilot projects out there where we would come into a county and survey a lot of cities, and then talk to the county folks, the city folks, and then come back with some ideas on where they could do more sharing of equipment, sharing of personnel, sharing of services. And I'll never forget it. One of the things I had to do as part of that job was I had to go to the Secretary of State's office. Now, keep in mind, this was before the internet. And this was, we went to the Secretary of State's office to survey and look at a whole bunch of 28 agreements that were buried in the basement of this place in these boxes. And they were not categories, put in a category by topic. They were brought in and put in boxes based upon the date that they were filed with the Secretary of State. Well, first of all, we were glad that they were even there, because it gave us a possibility of seeing all these 28 agreements and getting a feel for what was out there. So I went through those boxes of 28 agreements, agreement by agreement by agreement, and I highlighted the ones that I thought had value for duplication in other parts of the state. And so I put a little sticky note on all of them, and they were nice enough then to copy them for me. And then I took them all back to Iowa City and put up a category and listed them by topic, and library service was one of them. And it was that way that we would occasionally get calls from cities that say, hey, we're thinking about an agreement on this topic. And I'd go back into the files and I would send them a copy of similar agreements that have been done elsewhere. So I have been in this subject for a long, long time. And today, let's go to the next slide, Samantha, and kind of give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk a little bit about the history and types of agreements, but we're going to focus more on the process of putting them together. And then I'm going to give you my tips and suggestions on what I would do if I were in your position in putting together a good 2080 agreement. And then the other thing that I'm going to talk about is available resources that you can tap into and use if you're going to write a 2080 agreement. So, and also today I'm kind of talking to two different groups of people. Obviously, my primary focus is all those library directors, library board members out there, and how you can use a 2080 agreement in your community or county. And then the other the folks that I'm talking to are your city clerks and city administrators that might be tuning in today. So let's start with the history. In order to understand the history of 2080 agreements, and it goes back a long ways, I think it actually goes back to something that happened way back in 1968. In 1968, the voters of Iowa passed what is called the Home Rule, and it applied to cities and counties. And the principle was very simple. It said that as long as there was not a law that prohibited cities and counties from doing something, they could legally do it. And the only exception was anything to do with taxation. If it had something to do with taxation, that had to be in line with whatever the state of Iowa law was at the time. But if there's other things that cities and counties wanted to do in terms of a new service or whatever it is whatever laws they wanted to pass, as long as there was not in conflict with an existing law, they could do it. And that was a kind of revolutionary, because in order for cities to do something, it had to spell it out in the Code of Iowa that, yes, you can do this, and here's how you do it. And it was very detailed. And so if you wanted to do something that wasn't already allowed, you had to go get a special act from the Iowa legislature to get permission to do it. And so that changed all that in 1968. Shortly thereafter, and I'm guessing it's sometime in the early 1970s, the legislature enacted a chapter in the Code of Iowa called 28E. That's how this name came about, because Chapter 28E basically said, and it was a very simple purpose, and that is, if you can do something, city and county, if you can do it by yourself, and now you have the power to team up with other cities and other counties, and even not even just that, but boards and agencies and even private entities. You can now come together and do it as a joint effort. And that stated principle was very, very simple, but it had quite an impact on what cities and counties could now do. So let's go to the next slide. Now that this is section 1 of that chapter 28E. And what I want to call to your attention is that middle part there that says to provide joint services and facilities with other agencies. So now cities and counties and government, when this was passed, gives you that authority to reach out to other entities and do something together that you are perfectly legal in doing all by yourself. So, and the nice thing about it is that last sentence there that says it's to be interpreted to do whatever we can to make this work, to construe to that end. So, okay, let's go to the next slide. And that is, what is a 2080 agreement? Well, it's always a written document. It's not it's not a handshake. It is an actual legal document, and it's a written contract. And some people don't even use the term 2080 agreement, which is fine. They might refer to it as a contract. They might just refer to it as an agreement. It's the same thing. Simply because you add 2080 in front of it doesn't make it any different, okay? It is still a written contract. It's a written agreement. We just happen to use that title 28E because we're referencing that chapter of the Code of Iowa that gives you the legal authority to do this. And it can involve public entities. It can even involve a private agency. Now that's kind of rare. You don't see that too often, but occasionally a city might reach out to Well, an example I might give you is a garbage collection in the state of Iowa. It can be done by city government. It can be done by a county, or it can be done by a private company. And so there may be the need once in a while for a private company to team up with the city to provide that particular service. So it can involve more than just city government and county government. It can involve private agencies. But the whole gist of it is it's a better way to provide the service. That's what it's all about. And that's the primary purpose in doing it in the first place. And the key thing that makes this all different, of course, is you are required by law, once you do this 2080 agreement, is to be filed with the Secretary of State for the state of Iowa. And that's what kind of makes it unique in other things that in the private sector, because private companies can have all kinds of agreements with each other, but they don't have to file it with the Secretary of State like we do in city government. So, all right, let's go to the next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit about who's involved in this sort of thing. And the reason I wanted to quote to you the chapter 2080.4 was that, once again, this is where the authority that gives you that it can be one or more public or private agency. That second line there is key. It can be one or more. So a private agency, like I said, can be involved with this. And the other thing I really want to point out is that fourth line down where it says, including the creation of a separate entity to carry out the purpose of the agreement. So there's a number of different types of agreements that we're going to get into, but the one that really had a lot of impact and a lot of power that people tend to forget, you couldn't always do this, and that is to create a brand new agency, a brand new entity that never existed before, and now charge that new entity with some special thing that or service that you want it to be providing. And so there's a lot of agencies that have been created out there, basically because of this one section, 2080.4. All right, let's go to the next topic. As I already mentioned, eligible partners in these agreements, obviously cities, and that includes libraries, can be a part of these. County government, townships can be part of these. Now, the vast majority of 2080 agreements involving townships are one service usually, and that is fire protection, because townships trustees have the responsibility to provide fire protection to those rural areas. And how they do it is entirely up to them. Most townships will join together and form in an agency that provides fire protection to a number of the townships, or they will contract with a city. And so that's the same concept that's applied. And I mentioned before, the other entities would be private organizations, private corporations that you could contract with. And lastly, which is one that's kind of overlooked, which I rarely run across, and that is we could reach out to state agencies and have them as an eligible partner in this whole process. So, but there's a few of those out there, but vast majority of what I see and what I work with and what I'm going to talk about today are the top category, cities and counties. Okay. All right. Chapter 28.3, I want to call to your attention because it really talks about this whole public agency that I said that has a huge impact on cities and counties throughout the state, because this particular section is what they call the joint exercise of powers, where you all come together and you form this public agency that now has the same power that you had as a city or a library. And so it gives you a lot of authority. And like that last line says, all the powers, all the privileges, all the authority is now confirmed upon this public agency. So that new public agency that might be created once in a while has the same, powers and duties that maybe the city or the county does. So that's quite an impact on how we do some of these services if you go down this road and use this chapter. Okay, let's talk about the different types of agreements. When I did that collection of 2080 agreements at the Secretary of State's office 30 plus years ago, the most common one that I saw was law enforcement. And that's still the case today. There's a lot of law enforcement contracts out there involving maybe two cities. I can think of McGregor and Marquette. They have a joint law enforcement agency that provides police protection to both communities. The other thing I see is smaller towns contracting with the county sheriff's department for law enforcement protection. And so that's probably the most common one. Now, there's other ones too. The next most common one is probably fire protection. And as I mentioned to you before, that township trustee has an obligation to provide fire protection, but the code is silent on how they do it. And so the vast majority of trustees, when they provide fire protection, are using 2080 agreements in which they normally will contract with another township, another city, possibly. And then sometimes I see 2080 agreements for roads and public works projects. Sometimes I see cities come together and jointly purchase a piece of equipment. I might see the county engineer's office working together with the city to jointly pave a road that maybe covers both city and county area. Maybe half the roadway is county, half the roadway is city. I see that every once in a while. And then there's a lot of other categories, of which one is library services. And those include maybe where two towns come together and one town provides library service to another community, or they may have I've seen a couple out there where the library service works with the school district. And maybe the school district in the city library have some kind of a cooperative arrangement. So there's any number of different ways. And then occasionally you'll see where libraries will contract with counties to provide service to the rural areas. And sometimes these are written agreements, sometimes they're not, but they nonetheless, there is something in place that allows that rural resident to use the city's library. So let's go to the next slide. Now, there's some basic types of agreements, and I think it's important to there's what I consider three very broad categories when it comes to these agreements. The first one is when two entities come together and they're going to share something. It's usually sharing some equipment, or maybe it's sharing personnel. Maybe one entity has a person that is very knowledgeable in information technology, an IT person, or maybe we have someone that's very knowledgeable in personnel or finance or budgeting, and they want to share that person. And it could be any number of different ways that they will share equipment or sharing a person, but typically is along those two lines. Another very broad category is what I call the vendor-customer arrangement. And the vast majority of those fire protection agreements I talked about fit this category of the vendor-customer relationship. And in most cases, the vendor is the city and the customer is maybe the township trustees. But when it comes to libraries, most of the time it's the city library that is the vendor, and they're providing to a customer, in this case, county government, so that the rural residents can use the city's library. So it is very much a vendor-customer relationship. And I can tell you many times that I've worked with the trustees in the townships, they have a hard time understanding that it is a vendor-customer relationship, because even though they don't own a fire truck, and even though they don't own the fire station, they look upon themselves many times as an equal partner. And maybe in some sense that they are, because sometimes they're splitting the cost of a piece of equipment, and they see themselves as an equal partner, and they should have equal say in everything. But I think they tend to lose sight of the fact that the person or entity that owns the equipment and owns the building and probably has insurance on all of it, they are the owner. And as the owner, they're a vendor. It's just like any private business that provides a service to their customer, and they can choose how they provide that service. And most importantly, they can determine how much they will charge that person for that service. Because I see too many times where a city is kind of in the driver's seat, and they just pay whatever the person's willing to pay. And they're not under legal obligation to provide that service, certainly to provide that service for less cost than it takes to provide it. And one of the most frustrating things I see in city government sometimes is where a city is providing the service to this outside customer, and they're not charging what it's worth, or they're not charging what it costs to provide that service. And the bad thing about that is somebody's paying the bill. And so usually the city taxpayer is paying the bill. And if the customer that's getting this service is not paying their fair share, then the city taxpayer is subsidizing the rural taxpayer. And so that's the argument I try and make with township trustees. And that might be the argument sometime that you want to make with any other entity that wants to contract with you as a city for that particular service, is that we are a vendor customer. And it's almost like the in the private sector, we talk about the law of supply and demand. Of course, you're going to charge something. You got to realize that if I charge too much, one of two things will happen. They just won't buy the service and they'll get along without it, or they'll go to somebody else. And so if you're, for example, if you're city and you're charging for fire protection service, that township trustee has the option of starting their own fire department, which they probably won't because it's too expensive, or they have the option of contracting with another city, which they probably won't, because if it doubles the response time on a fire call, that's not an attractive option. So many times you're the one that they're going to for that service. And man, if you don't provide it, they're in a whole world of hurt. So, and then lastly, the other big thing that I talked about earlier is a brand new agency is created. And when that happens, there's a lot of hoops that need to be jumped through. And the 2080 agreement that does that creates the 2080 agency, has some very explicit language on what should and should not go in to that particular 2080 agreement. So if you're ever part of a 2080 agreement that's being put together and it involves the creation of a new agency, make sure that you take a good hard look at chapter 2080 and you follow it step by step and do all the things that you need to do. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And that is, why would you do this? Why would you go through the effort of doing a 2080 agreement? There's usually three reasons. Number one, you want to do things more effectively. You're looking for a better way to do something. Second thing is you want to be more efficient at what you're doing. Maybe you're looking at maybe saving a little money. That's all, great. Sometimes it doesn't involve saving money, but it's just being more efficient of what it is you're doing, because now you've teamed up with someone else, and between the two of you, you've come up with a better way of doing something. And lastly, it might be to just improve a working relationship that you have with another entity, so that it's very clear, this is our role in this relationship, and this is their role in this relationship. So it clearly defines what it is both parties are expected to be doing, which then hopefully results in a good working relationship. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about putting together a 2080 agreement. And I love baseball. And so I like to use what I call my baseball analogy. Came up with this idea a long time ago. And so we're getting, well, I don't know if we're going to have a spring training session for baseball with the ongoing talks and strike. But anyway, what we're looking for early in the game is that early planning, where you kind of do a little brainstorming on what it is you're going to do, how you're going to do it. And then we move into that design phase where we say, okay, here's what we're trying to do. Now, how do we get there? How do we put this together? And then once we've got an idea of what we want to do and a design phase, how are we going to implement it and put it into place and make sure it works? And the other thing that's always important to consider is there anything that's going to get in the way? Are we going to run up against any barriers? or adversary situations that we need to at least be aware of going into this process. So I think it's important very early on for whoever's involved just to step back and say, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this, and here's some of the issues we might run into, so we're better prepared to move forward. Okay, let's go into the next phase. And that is that putting together that basic game plan. How is it we're going to execute this plan? And how is it that we're going to come out on the other side a winner? Okay, so we want to do that early planning. We want to, now let's go to the next slide. Okay. Okay, this is what I call the spring training phase. And that is, number one, I think it's critical that before you embark upon one of these, sometimes there's not an easy, quick fix to something, and sometimes there is, but don't expect everything to be a very quick fix on when doing something like this, and fully expect that if you're doing something really different that's never been tried before, fully expect that there's going to be quite a bit of resistance to that change. And it's important that you very early on identify all the partners that need to be at the table and be a part of these discussions. Because if you are trying to put something like this together and you're leaving out a significant partner, I can guarantee you things will not go well in this whole process. And lastly, then put together your team that's going to follow through and get this going and get it done. And lastly, you want to look for is building the consensus and building the support for what it is you're trying to do. Because if you don't get that consensus and support on what you're trying to do, it will probably not be successful. So, all right, let's go into the design phase of actually putting this game plan into place. You're going to identify the core issues that are involved. And it's so critical that all the issues be put on the table very early on so that you don't get blindsided later with some things that you hadn't thought about or you hadn't expected. You're also going to want to take a look at how much is it going to cost? Not only the cost after the agreement is put together, but is there going to be a cost in putting it together? Are we going to pay the person that is the author, who I'll talk about later? Will we have legal fees? And so what are those upfront costs? And then once it's all put in place, what is a fair cost for all the entities involved? And I think it's critical to prepare a timetable where you kind of identify the steps in the process, and then you put a time frame on all of them. And if it involves a number of meetings, I think it's good to identify when we're going to meet, what days we're going to meet, so everybody can get that on their calendar, because we're all very busy and we all have other things going on. And the best thing we can do to keep things moving is to have a very clear timetable of what we're going to do when, so that people can get those dates on their calendar. So it all comes down to developing an action plan. And I have a checklist later that I'm going to talk to you about of kind of what goes into that action plan and how you implement it. Okay. Now we're into the full season, and we're going to basically stick to that action plan that you put together. We're also going to may need to do a public relations campaign, because if we need to get buy-in from the citizen or the taxpayer, we might need to be thinking in terms of how do we get the word out of what we're doing and why it's important and why we're even doing this, so that we don't have a situation later where we haven't informed the public what we're doing. And now suddenly we get way into it. And now we got a lot of naysayers out there that's saying what you're doing is a waste of time. And that's not what you want to see. The other thing was we need to get commitments from people that this is important to them and that they will follow through on it and that they're going to work with you, because there's no sense in pursuing one of these things if the one or more of the parties is like, yeah, you can do what you want, but I'm not going to commit to that. I'm not going to agree to that. And so now you've wasted a lot of time. So you want to reach out and get that commitment from them as well. And you want to assign responsibility. Who's going to be the author? Who's going to take it to the different boards or commissions to get their approval? And don't forget that even though you've got this great plan, there may come a time to change it. There needs to be a time to evaluate it. So you need to be thinking in terms of that. Now, you might get into this process and there might be a new election in the middle of it. And you got a bunch of new people coming on board and what we call the rookie players. Okay. These rookies come on the scene in the middle of what you're trying to do. And now they have no idea what happened before they got there. And so it's critical, I think, to reach out to those rookie players very early in the process, even if they're not necessarily the ones sitting at the table at that particular time, but down the road, they might be asked to approve it. You want to make sure that those new board members, be it a new member of the Board of Supervisors, a new council member, a new library board member, that you reach out to them and include them very early so that you just don't assume that when the day comes for their approval, that they're just going to automatically approve it, even though they knew absolutely nothing about what you were doing or why you were doing it. And the other advice I would give you is be tenacious. If you run up against one issue that kind of gives you a slight defeat, hey, figure out what you need to do, make the adjustments, and move on. Okay, let's go to some of the barriers you're going to run into. You know, but lack of cohesion, sometimes getting everybody on the same page, finding those folks that are difficult to, they have difficulty focusing. Maybe they got so many other things going on in their life. They're busy people. You know, that sometimes is kind of difficult. So that's why it's so important to have a good leader that is leading these meetings and leading the discussions to keep everybody focused. That's where you do something, the simplest things like putting down the cell phone, turning off the cell phone before we start this meeting so we can really focus on what it is we're doing and leave things behind. And this is our number one priority right now, to hammer out the details of this agreement or what it is we're trying to do. The other thing is watching for those hidden agendas where maybe some people have different ideas on what they want to accomplish through this process. And they're not totally honest with you. Now, hopefully you're not going to deal with that sort of thing too often, but occasionally we do have these folks that come in with these agendas that maybe have nothing to do with what we're trying to get done here today. And lastly, if there's any liability concerns that you might have to deal with, that might involve reaching out to an insurance agent. Boy, if you're creating a new public agency, a new 28E agency that's providing library service of what it is that agency is going to provide, there will be liability concerns that you need to address, because that new agency is going to need to get their own insurance coverages. And so if you're talking about a new agency and any of these things that you're doing, you need to reach out to a knowledgeable insurance agent who can then address any issues of liability. And boy, if you're going to get bogged down and reach an area where you can't agree on, this next one is where it's going to be, and that is the allocation of cost. All of these things look great, and you think it's going to be a wonderful plan and it's going to really work. And then you get down to the nitty gritty, who's going to pay what, and what is the fair share of all the entities involved. And so that is the part that you need to think about ahead of time, and you need to have a good game plan and a fair way to allocate the cost, or a fair way to come up with the cost if it's just a joint agreement where one entity provides service to the other. Because boy, if you're going to reach the point and do a lot of work, and then you're going to crash and burn because this part you couldn't get past, that's why you have this kind of game plan in mind as you go through this process of how we're going to address all these things and how we're going to come up with a fair allocation of cost. This is where township trustees and city fire departments get kind of crossways in terms of what the trustees think is a fair allocation of cost, may be totally different than what the city fire department thinks is a fair allocation of cost. Same thing. I think one of the things that library boards run into is that county board of supervisors. What do they think is a fair share of what they should pay to a library board for library service for rural residents? If you have a board of supervisors member who doesn't put much value in library service, guess what? They're not going to be inclined to put a lot of money into library service and the payments that they would make to the city's libraries in their county. So this is very critical part, and where a lot of places get bogged down and sometimes get this far and never reach an agreement. Okay, let's go to my checklist. As part of this grant that I did a number of years ago at the Institute of Public Affairs, I thought, you know what? What would be good for people to have that are working on 28 agreements than to have a checklist? And so I've gotten a lot of comments over the years on this little checklist that I put together. And it's not rocket science. It's fairly simple, but it's just a kind of a step-by-step. And it starts out with number one: clearly define what it is you're doing. What governmental service are we talking about? What cooperative effort are we talking about? Basic, number one, so that we are distinct from any other category of or other service. It is primarily focused in this area. Number two, identify all the partners. Who is it that's involved? And make sure you get the correct legal proper name of all the entities. You know, if it is the city of Tama, you put in there the city of Tama, Iowa. If it's a county, you put in there it is Clayton County, Iowa, so that there's no misunderstanding. These are the entities that are involved in this particular 2080 agreement. Number three, you got to have a good working draft of the agreement. Someone needs to step up to the plate and say, I will take this on. I will start putting together the working draft. Number four, as you start going through that draft, you're going to make changes. And so that's why you might have more than one meeting, particularly if you're talking about creating a new agency. That gets kind of complicated. So you might have a number of changes, and in which case you might have more than one meeting. And then once you get to the point where you've got a good working draft and you're pretty close to what it is you want to do, at some point you may want to run it by either the city attorney or the county attorney or some legal counsel and say, hey, look this draft over that we have done and tell us, is there anything we've overlooked? Is there any language in here that needs to be cleaned up a little bit to make it have people have a better understanding? Now, I am not a firm believer in having an attorney write the agreement from the beginning to end, because number one, you will incur quite a bit of cost because attorneys charge a lot of money per hour for their services because they have a very specialized profession. And so I think it's a better use of your time for someone in the group that's a good writer, that can write things that people can read and understand. And the nice thing about 2080 agreements, there's a pretty good chance you do not have to reinvent the wheel. There's a pretty good chance somebody else has done that. Now you take what they did, learn what they did. And I'm not saying that you just take it verbatim the way they did it and take out their name and put your name in, although I do see that from time to time. But yet the format that's put together, you can learn a lot from what other cities and counties have done on 28 agreements. So do that first, then take it to your attorney for that review. Okay, let's go to number six. Number six, once we've got that good working draft, we're thinking we're on pretty good legal ground. We want to circulate and send copies of that draft to the agencies that we're going to seek approval from. And the other thing I like to do is to make it really simple. And the way you make it simple for them is you might meet with them and then go through the agreement, see what questions they have, but then give them a model resolution. Because most entities that approve these agreements, they need to do it by some formal structure. And in city government, that formal structure is something called a resolution. And so you might give them a model resolution that they can then follow. Because if you leave it up to them to write their own resolution, chances are they're going to leave something out that should have been in there. So you want to develop a good model resolution. And, you know, years ago, I didn't have the luxury 30, 40 years ago when I was doing these of Word documents. And so it is so easy now for you to write that model resolution, leave the name blank, okay? Send it to the computer of the person on the with the entity, and then they start filling in the blanks. You want to make it that easy for them. You want to circulate that agreement among all the entities where you need a signature. And you want to make it very clear, you know, who all is signing the agreement, have space for them to sign. And then once you've got all those signatures gathered, you're now ready to move to the next step, and that is to file a copy with the Secretary of State. And I like to, you know, I don't know if you have to do this, but I always like to give one original signed copy back to all the entities. And so it's fairly easy to do if there's only 2 or 3, but if there's 5 or 6 entities involved, it takes a little more time because everybody is signing 5 copies of the same thing. I just think it looks better and it adds a little more structure when you're doing these agreements. And the other thing I always tell people, this is really simple, but sign with blue ink because anymore the copies that you use black ink, you look at that copy and say, is that an original or is that a copy of it? And so we kind of have a standard rule in one of the companies I used to work with, and that is all legal documents had to be signed with blue ink. So it was very clear this was indeed an original copy. Okay, what goes into a 2080 agreement? What's in the contents? And once again, I put together another checklist for people. Okay, the first thing we need to do is a title for the agreement. And the title preferably would identify who the entities are. It would identify what the nature of it is. So in Library Board's case, it will identify, you know, the city of Central City and Lynn County are providing library services for rural residents, you know, that sort of thing, so that there's, when someone else looks at this and they can see very quickly, well, here's who's involved and here's what this agreement is all about. Now, what's the duration of the agreement? Maybe you put it together and it's for 2 years or 4 years. And so, because you've got to identify an end date on some of these things. And so, and that doesn't mean that the agreement may be, you know, over with. You might have a language in there that says that unless both sides, you know, give notice, it continues on, but something in there that describes the duration. And then if you create a new agency, what is that new organization? Precisely, what is it? What's the composition of it? And what's this nature of this new entity that you just created? The other thing is, what powers did you now give to that new entity? What is it that they can legally do? Most of the time it's transferring a power that you have as a city or a county and transferring that power to now this new separate entity. I mentioned to you McGregor and Marquette that do law enforcement together. They took that law enforcement responsibility and police protection and now transferred it to this new separate agency that was created to provide law enforcement to those 2 communities. So, and number 5 then is if you created this new corporation, you identify the name of this new public corporation. If you think back years and years ago, every town had their own little landfill. Now, years and years ago, we didn't call them landfills. They were all called the city dump, okay? And that's what they were called, the city dump, okay? And unfortunately, that wasn't very good for the environment. And unfortunately, a lot of things got buried in some of those city dumps that probably shouldn't have been buried there. But Chapter 28E allowed all these small towns and the county to come together, and they formed a new public corporation, and they called it, you know, a landfill agency. And so as a result, all those little dumps got closed up and shut down. And now all the solid waste in an area came to this new county landfill that was created. But even though their landfills were created, we're getting fewer and fewer of these landfills anymore, that they're going to big landfills in more regional basis. But bottom line is, new public corporation was created. And so, and another thing I've seen happen in recent years is the creation of a public corporation that provides economic development services to throughout the city. So there is the possibility, although I think it would be rare, for library boards to come together and say, you know what, we're going to create a new public corporation that's going to provide service. Earlier this week, I was in Tama, Toledo area, and I met with the Tama City Council. And obviously, those two communities are side by side. They're separated by Highway 30, but they're about the same population. And I can see so many departments within those two cities coming together and forming possibly a new separate agency to provide a service. They already have a new agency that was formed between the two of them for a municipal swimming pool and a municipal aquatic center that they jointly own, but this agency oversees this new swimming pool. I don't see any reason why that example can't be duplicated on other services like library services. You know, as an outsider looking in, I'm like, why would both communities have to have a separate and maintain their own separate library when they're right next door to each other? You know, and why couldn't those two cities come together and have one library that serves both communities? Now, I can tell you that there's a long, rich history and tradition in both of those two cities that say, no, we're not. We're going to keep doing our own separate library, which is all fine. And if you can afford it, you know, hey, more power to you. But I predict that the day will come when the tax revenues are not going to be sufficient to keep providing all of these services separate and distinct. I see a note here, Huxley and Ballard have a 2080 agreement on sharing a middle school library. Hey, that's another good one, reaching out to the school system. I like that. So there's all kinds of examples out there where separate entities have created and new public corporations are put together. Let's go to number 6. Getting back to the content. Boy, this number 6 is really critical. How are we going to pay for it? Okay. And if you ever, like I told you earlier, if you're ever going to, you know, reach the point where we can't finish it, it's because we can't reach an agreement on money. You know, how are we going to finance this joint undertaking? That one is the big deal. All of this list, that's the one that maybe require the most thought and the most give and take. Number 7 is we have to have in there something about maintaining and establishing a budget, because most of the time we're talking about public money. We're talking about taxpayer money involved in these ventures. So we have to make it very clear that yes, indeed, there will be a budget and the manner in which it's put together and how all the entities are going to be told how this budget is done. I just helped a fire department, a rural fire department in Rockwell, Iowa. And one of the things that they were doing in Rockwell was there was not a lot of structure to their library, or not to the library, to their budget process. And so I put together a 2080 agreement that talks about how to put more structure into putting the budget together and establishing it and maintaining it. And number 8, once you put the work into this and have this put together, I hope you don't have to use number 8, but you're required by chapter 2080 to have some language in there that if that ever happens, here's how you terminate that agreement and make sure that, you know, the property is disposed of properly, which is number 9 then, is a method then to dispose of any property that that particular agency has acquired and accumulated, or maybe the assets. Maybe there's money in the bank and this thing has all been dissolved and now there's some assets there and money in the bank. What's the proper way to dispose of that so that everything can be closed down and things get transferred back to that other entity? Once again, I hope this never happens. I hope you never have to go down this road, but you're required then to have the section in there that talks about it. And number 10 is make sure you've got adequate space then for all the signatures on your 2080 agreement and that you've identified the right people. I a lot of times like to put the actual name of the person that's going to sign rather than, library board president. I like to put down the name of the library board president that's actually going to sign it. So, because we all know people's signatures are sometimes, you swear they all went to medical school. Because I don't know if you've ever seen your doctor's signatures, but most of the time you can't read them. And I think the same thing can happen here. I like to see clearly the printed name of the person, so I know this is who signed this, in case you ever have to, contact the people involved in the process. And maybe nothing else, maybe the 5 or 10 years from now, maybe you want to go back and see what the history was on a particular section, and you want to identify, well, who wrote this, and who did it, and who signed it. Okay. Going on to the last few items in the content. Number 11 there, as I mentioned, that model resolution. That resolution that they all approve should summarize what the intent was, that they're giving approval to the agreement, and they're giving authorization to whoever it is that's going to sign, whether it's the president of the library board, whether it's the mayor, whether it's the chairperson of the county board of supervisors. Who is it that's being authorized to sign this on our behalf? What's the effective date? When is it going to take place? And then if there's a separate board that's been created, who serves as kind of the staff person to the board, the administrator? Now, this person may or may not get paid for that service, but it's kind of nice to identify who that person is that kind of serves as the staff to the Joint Powers Board. And sometimes you may not know who that person is. And I'm not talking about an administrator in the sense of a city administrator or county administrator. I'm just talking in terms of someone who is kind of like the staff person for that board. And number 14, the owning of personal property, how it's going to be acquired, who's holding it, how it would be disposed of, that sort of thing. And lastly, if you do make amendments to your agreement, you're required to file again with the Secretary of State. So always keep in mind. Now, oddly enough, and I'm kind of surprised this is in there because I think it's kind of short notice, but if you read the fine print in Chapter 28E, it says that if you do amendments, once the amendment is approved, you're supposed to file that with the Secretary of State's office within 30 days. Let's talk a little bit about my tips and suggestions. The first one is kind of a no-brainer. You want to read Chapter 28E. You want to see what's in there. In my little handout that I gave you the kind of like the table of contents of what's in there. You want to create that good study group, those key players. And hopefully the study group and the key players are people who are open to this concept, that they're willing to invest the time and effort to do it. So if you put together that study group and half of them on there think this is the dumbest thing you ever come up with, obviously nothing much is going to get done. So it's critical that you put together a good group. Also, and I can't stress this one enough too, you need to designate someone who is a good writer, someone who has good writing skills that's going to take the time to write this agreement and keep on their computer the various drafts of the agreement, so that as it's modified and updated between meetings, that person keeps track of it and incorporates those changes, and make sure then at the end of the day, when you're all done, that you have a very cohesive, well-written agreement that everybody can read and understand, yes, this is what we're doing. And we need to be inclusive on the membership on the team. If you have a few doubting Thomases, probably doesn't hurt to put them on the team. What I do hesitate to put on the team, though, is that guy that complains about everything, or the term we use in city government sometimes is the cave people, citizens against virtually everything, because they will sabotage the whole process. But the doubting Thomas isn't necessarily a bad person to have on there. They can be kind of the person that serves as the catch-22, who says, we haven't thought about that. We haven't thought about this. And so that person sometimes can be a valuable member of a group. It's just that I really hesitate to put those cave people on there because then you might find that the rest of the people just throw up their hands and quit. So, and you do need to allow enough time for these negotiations to take place. You don't necessarily want to rush them. Most of the time when you're doing these agreements, there's plenty of time to work out the details and do a good job on them. Let's go to the next slide, and that is number 6. I can't stress enough the importance of circulating a draft to all the parties to review. And this used to be a big deal before the internet and before computers. Now it's just a matter of getting everyone's email address and then putting all their addresses into your computer, and then clearly identify first draft, second draft, third draft, fourth draft, whatever number it is. I also like to put a date on it as well, so that people will know, oh my goodness, yeah, we met on March 10th, and this is the March 10th draft. And you don't want them spending time looking on the January 5th draft. You want them to focus on the most current draft. So put the draft number on there and put a date on there so that there's no confusing that this is the most current draft that we're working with. Number 7, you need to be flexible and patient. These things don't happen overnight. And so sometimes it does require a little patience. And then once we've got it nailed down, now get that final agreement out there well in advance. Don't expect a board or a council or a board of supervisors to get this elaborate agreement on let's say on Monday morning, and you're expecting that the board meeting Tuesday morning, they're going to approve it. You're setting yourself up for failure when you do that. Give them plenty of time to look it over. Tell them that you're giving them this amount of time and that we would hope that you would be able to approve it on this date. So you need to schedule their meeting and get it out to them a week or two ahead of time, so they've got plenty of time to read it. And then also put in there the caveat: if you see anything you don't understand, you call us, and then have that person to call. And then, getting that official approval then from all the entities. And there's where it comes back to maybe that go-to person, that lead person that stepped up at the plate and said, I'll take the lead on this. I will keep track of whose approval we got, whose approval we're waiting on, and that sort of thing. And then number 10, if you get this job done, be sure and share the credit, because people like to get credit for what they've done, the work they put into it. And because you might need to work with that same group of people again on something else. And so by, a good pat on the back and sharing the credit is certainly nothing wrong with doing that. So, okay, getting close here. I think we need to wrap it up, it looks like. A couple of things I want to point out to you. The Secretary of State's role, you're required by point E to file it, and it can be done by electronic. It's so easy to do. So don't be intimidated. Go to the website and you'll see how easy it is. There's a website address is on there. If you have any concerns, you've got an 800 number there to call. So there's a lot of good information on there. The library agreements, let's go to the next slide. Someone asked me, should we, if it involves the library, do we need council approval? Well, I guess my best answer to that might be, it depends, okay? If you're creating a brand new entity, probably, okay? If one library board to another library board and maybe you're sharing something, maybe not, but I would review these 2 chapters. Read chapter 392 of the Code of Iowa, read chapter 384, Division 5, see if those 2 chapters pertain to what you're doing. Bottom line, my recommendation for me is I would seek the support and approval of the city council on some of this stuff, because it's so important to maintain that good working relationship with your council, like I talked about in another session a while back. And nothing is more disheartening to a council member than to hear something secondhand. And so I think it's important that you reach out to them, let them know what you're doing. And at this point, unless your attorney tells you differently, I would plan on running it by the council for council approval, if for no other reason to maintain that good relationship. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And that is library service for rural residents. This is that vendor-customer relationship I talked about earlier. I think it is great if you can get a 2080 agreement with your county board of supervisors. To me, that's the preferred option. Now, is it done everywhere? No, it's not. Probably most of the time it's not done anywhere. But the reason I like it is it sets a standard for the future so that new members of the board of supervisors that come onto the scene can see that previous boards thought this was important enough to put it in writing. And so it adds some formality, it adds some importance to the whole thing. It explains the value of the service, so that the board can say, yes, we are paying this, but we're getting this in return. So it does a good job of doing that. And it can also be used to share the numbers and the usage of the library by your rural residents. Last few things we'll talk about before we wrap it up, and that is available resources. Boy, there's a lot of stuff out there. You've got my checklist now. The city council members in Iowa have what is called a Municipal Policy Leaders Handbook. I helped put that together years and years ago. I hope it's still chapter 12. I haven't seen the latest draft, but in chapter 12, there's something in there. The Secretary of State's office, the website, has all the 2080 agreements that have ever been filed listed there for you. I made you a copy of the ones that were library boards or library services of some type. And so you can see there's a number of them to choose from. I haven't checked on this, but in 2005, Iowa State University did a study on 2080 agreements. And so I haven't looked here lately to see if they've kept that up to date and they're still doing it, but that might be a resource if you're getting, especially if you're getting into a 2080 agreement that's kind of unusual, maybe have never been tried before. And lastly, the Iowa League of Cities has done a special report on city collaboration. My checklists that I developed years ago are in that special report. And so it's a great tool. So if you go to the Iowa League of Cities website and go under resources and then go under publications, you will find that special report. And I would urge you to look at it. And then my last wrap-up slide. And this is an idea that I got from a gentleman I've known for years. His name is Tim Mormon. He's the city administrator in Waukee, but he's been in Dubuque, Mason City, and Jefferson over his career. He wrote his thesis on this topic. And bottom line of his thesis was this: in order for these things to work, in order for cooperative agreements, sharing agreements, 2080 agreements to work, 5 things have to be in place. If you're missing one of these 5 things, it's probably not going to happen and it's not going to be get done. Number 1, a perceived need to act. You recognize the importance of doing this. And number 2, the reason you're doing it is to do something more efficiently and more effectively than the way you had been doing it in the past. So there's an interest in efficiency and effectiveness. May or may not involve saving money. Number 3, there's a belief in investing the time and resources to put this all together, because it will take time, it will take effort, and it might involve resources. It might involve a legal opinion. So it might involve some costs. So there has to be a belief that it's worth it, that it's worth our time and effort. And number 4, mutual benefits. This is probably the big one. If one party says, this is not to our benefit, this is a waste of our time, this agreement is not going to take place. So it's got to be mutual beneficial to all the parties. And last but not least, mutual trust. If there is a lack of trust between the entities putting this together or the people putting this together, this is going to crash and burn and be a total failure. Because once that trust is gone, you might as well start all over, or you might as well just abandon the idea. So all 5 of these conditions have to be in place, I think, in order for this to be successful. Okay, let's go to the last slide, and that is just any last minute questions we have. Here, see, let's see, any questions that we've got so far? Any examples anyone want to share? Success stories, recommendations? How are we doing on time, Samantha?
It is 3:05, so we should
Okay,
probably plan on wrapping up here.
okay,
There is an easy low-hanging fruit question. Can a library
okay.
have a 28 okay, sorry. Can a library in one county have a 28E agreement with a town in a different county?
I think they can. Yes. Yeah. I don't think there's anything prohibits that. No.
There was a lot of chatter in the chat as well, and we may need to follow up with your district consultant about this, about libraries and 28E agreements
Okay.
and counties in general. And so I think that could be something that perhaps the district consultants can take up in their office hours if people have additional questions about that.
Okay.
I would encourage folks to scroll back through the chat and look at some of that. There are several questions that are rolling through, and again, we are out of time for our webinar today. So I do, if Patrick has a few minutes and wants to stick around to answer,
Yeah.
we can keep the recording
Stick
rolling.
around.
Okay.
You bet.
So I will read questions as they come through in the
Okay.
chat.
Yeah.
Should we treat money separately in a budget if the city contracts with the library?
Um, the state budgeting process for cities has very clear programs that you have to adhere to. And then within that individual budget, there's line items. I think it would be good to have a special line item that clearly identifies that particular source of income and that particular expense for something to do with 28E agreements. Now, is it legally required? If you haven't created an agency, a new agency, it's probably not legally required, but I think it's a good idea to do it, simply so you can track the money and answer questions down the road if you need to. I think you'd be well advised to do it, let's say.
Okay. Someone mentions the 28E money is listed in revenue, but not in expenses.
Yeah, you could, I suppose, particularly when you're the entity, you're the vendor providing the service and you've got money coming in. Yes, treat that as a separate item under revenues. So you know how much money is coming in, so you can share with whoever asks you how much money did you take in. But as far as expenses are concerned, that's a little more difficult to pull out. I think what I would do is maybe when you do your budget, have a little footnote saying, okay, let's say we're sharing a person. Let's say we're sharing a children's library director position, and approximately 40% of their time is spent in this other city. Maybe a little footnote that we're paying 100% of the bill, but we're getting 40% of it reimbursed to us by, city ABC type thing. But I think, once again, the more you can kind of clearly show the revenues and where they come from, where they're going, the better it is for you to explain it to city council members, to mayors, to boards of supervisors. And so the more detail you have, probably the better off you will be. So, but I also know it's within reason too. You can get bogged down in trying to document every dollar you spend and that sort of thing. So, but I think sometimes just having a good general idea that, hey, we're providing the service and 40% of the person's time, goes to that city, and we've got to figure it out. 40% of having that person on payroll is this much, and that's what they're paying.
Here's another sort of budgeting related question. What if the city of the town library a town is contracting with wants the money to go to general budget and not really to cover extra expenses and extra library services?
Okay. That's where you go back to the council before you even have the agreement and you reach an understanding with them. What I used to do in my cities where I worked in was within the general fund. The general fund is kind of all encompassing. Okay. I used to have subcategories within the general fund, and I had a subcategory for the library. And so when money would come in that was generated by the library, I would show it as money that came in to the library and give credit to the library. Now, not every city clerk does that. Not every city manager does that. I would highly recommend that they do it because I think it helps clearly distinguish that this money is coming in from the police department, like fines, the fire department, they got money coming in from township trustees. I always treated all of my departments as separate standalone businesses as best I could. And the library was no different. But there is this quote, it gets lost in the general fund when the money comes in. I get it. And that's why I tried to do separate, distinct budgets for each department. And I would hope that your city clerk, your city manager, or city administrator understands that concept and does something the same. Yeah,
absolutely.
but
I also would encourage folks that, a good next step after leaving today, if you are a town that has contracting services with another town, or maybe you provide services, would be to go on that state auditor's website and look and see if your 2080 agreement is on file, or if this is just something that's been informally done. So
like
that kind of came up in the chat as well. Like, I think we contract with some towns, but I don't see the name of our town on the state auditor's website. So
I went to like I said, the website and downloaded the ones that said anything to do with libraries. So I think there was like 60 of them. My gut feeling is we're missing a bunch of them, and that people didn't follow through and file them like they're supposed to. Now, the thing is, there's nothing in 2080 agreement says there's $1,000 fine if you don't file it. You're not going to go to jail if you don't file it, but you're supposed to do it. And I think it's a good idea because the Secretary of State serves as the clearinghouse for all these agreements so that other people can learn from them, which I suspect that's why it was set up, is to serve as a clearinghouse so we're not reinventing the wheel every time.
Absolutely. I haven't seen any other questions come through here today. So I think we have one slide left, or this is our last slide. All right.
We might have one more. I don't know. Just contact information. Yeah.
Yes, I don't see it if maybe my scroll isn't working, but we have a comment in chat. My assistant city manager says the state auditors are cracking down on this. So maybe this means you might want to get that agreement submitted sooner rather than later. I don't know if there could be.
I didn't know that. We do kind of have a new state auditor, I know, and you see things a little differently than some other places. So that could very well be. I appreciate that tip. Yeah, that's a good point.
Either way, good to have it done. So thank you very much, Patrick, for joining us today. This has been a very helpful session, and we're certainly very thankful to have the recording as well. So
hi to the folks up in Cresco. I just saw that.
Yes, we have.
Their mayor is a former library director in Cresco.
Ah, wonderful.
Not Cresco, that's Decorah, but Cresco. I'm working in Cresco right now doing the capital improvements plan. So hello to the folks in Cresco. Okay.
Yes. Well, thank you. I will make sure that we send out today's slides and the handout that's been mentioned a few times to everyone, whether you're joining us as a librarian or whether somebody on the more on the city side. But I have contact information for everyone, so I'll make sure that gets sent out. I did have one request for an earlier recording from a different session that we did, so I will make sure that gets distributed as well.
Okay.
I don't think I have anything else to say except a big thank you to Patrick, who was here in Des Moines doing county training. So he's actually joining me from another part of the state library's main offices here in Des Moines. So we wish you safe travels home in the snow. And if it's snowy wherever you are, stay warm and be safe as well. So thanks everyone for coming, and we will see you next time.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.